got to polish this thing off, okay?
You don't seem to understand. These new interpretations
Because what I do understand, look, I know what's in the report, so I'll take the information with me, right? If we've got to polish up, we've got to get the product on the market. So do us a favor, will you? Don't worry about it.
But all I need is a few moments before the board.
Yes, I know, but the big man's going to be there, and we've got to wrap it up today. We just don't have any choice, okay?
For the last quarter of a century, the study of groups and their behavior has occupied an important place in psychology. Since we are a culture in which groups play an increasingly dominant role, this interest in their behavior is not surprising. Among the many avenues of investigation into the dynamics of groups, few have received more attention of late than the process by which groups reach decisions.
All right. Now that Phil's here, we can start. We have only one item to discuss today, and I think we can wrap that up rather briefly. Whether or not we proceed with the marketing of Birotonin, our new weight-reducing pill. Now, before we begin, there are some things I'd like to say rather informally. We've all known each other a long time, long enough to see this company grow into one of the major factors in our industry. And one of the reasons I'm excited about Birotonin is that it can allow us to continue this growth. It should also allow us to increase our dividends to our shareholders. They've been behind us, and they deserve the kind of reward that Birotonin can bring. I also know that some outside test reports have come in that are not completely positive, and I want these brought up today. All right. I'll turn it over to you. Phil, why don't you give us a quick rundown on the marketing?
Since you've all received my memo on the basic market strategy, let me just touch base on key figures. Now, we project paying back our investment in 14 months. After 3 years, we expect a $2.3 million cumulative profit, which represents a return on investment of 29%. Now, simply put, this means we can make a lot of money with a very good product. And at the same time, we can make a lot of unhappy fat people a little thinner and a little happier.
What about the competition? Do we have anything to worry about?
Well, I think we've got the most effective product in Birotonin.
My people estimate a 35% share of market in 2 years.
Dick, what about the government? Have you got all the necessary clearances?
We're okay in D.C. Of course, the FDA may re-examine after a year on the market, but for now we're free and clear. The only problem is those outside tests. If more unfavorable results come in, well, those FDA guys love to be troublemakers.
Sure. It gets them good press. The government protecting the poor taxpayer.
Jerry, as the House pessimist, how do you read those reports?
Obviously, my department wouldn't have recommended Birotonin unless we felt it was basically safe. But still, some of those reports that came back from our sample group of doctors aren't too good. They hint...
What percentage, Jerry?
What?
What percentage of the reports are negative?
Oh, very small, less than 2%.
How serious are the symptoms?
Well, one doctor reported vomiting with one of his patients. Another suspected blood clots. One patient had dizzy spells.
It's not very dramatic stuff.
Well, they sound like the kind of symptoms that could be brought on by anything. Well, that kind of data is not very conclusive. Besides, we pick our physician sampling at random. Now, some of those doctors could be quacks or professional cranks. Now, we know we've got the best people in our lab. They are the ones we ought to trust.
Harriet, do you see any liability problems?
Oh, you know a lawyer doesn't like to be pinned down in advance. Now, the problem is that precedents for this kind of a situation aren't that clear-cut. The safe answer would be to test further.
Yeah, you know, Harriet's got a pretty good point. My God. If lawyers had their way, the whole drug industry would still be just making aspirin. You've got to take some risks in this business. Besides, we're not selling Birotonin over the counter. It's a strict prescription-only product. Any doctor who doesn't feel sure about it doesn't have to prescribe it.
Not only that, we have built one of the finest reputations in the field by dealing squarely with the public. We're not about to endanger that with a faulty product.
Okay, all right. Let's try to stay together on this. I'm sure Harriet wasn't trying to upset the apple cart. Phil, what about this memo from Dr. Heller wanting to address the meeting? Did you talk to him about it?
That's why I was late. He caught me as I was coming in. His sentiments as always, are basically conservative. It was the usual stuff about wanting to test more and so on. But knowing how rushed we were, I thought I'd relay this information. Otherwise, we'd just be sitting here for 30 minutes listening to him.
Peter, Heller's in your group. What do you think?
Well, he's a minority of one. The rest of the group is quite confident. They've been very conscientious.
Let's go with it. We don't have anything to worry about.
Anyone else? I guess it's unanimous. We go with it.
This group, and the decision it has just reached, was affected by groupthink, a concept which is the subject of a recent book by Dr. Irving Janis. In a discussion with Dr. David Knaus, Dr. Janis will explain what groupthink is, its relation to group dynamics as a whole, and its particular relevance to the Byrotonin decision.
When I was a graduate student in your seminar on group dynamics a few years ago, I remember you were just beginning to formulate some of the ideas which have resulted in the groupthink hypothesis. Now, since you posit that groupthink is a phenomenon which occurs only in highly cohesive groups, perhaps we ought to begin by talking a little bit about what social psychologists mean by a cohesive group.
Well, basically, a cohesive group is one whose members are very positive in their feeling toward the group and are very strongly motivated to retain their membership in the group. Now, you can look at executive committees, work groups of various types, friendship cliques, athletic teams. All of these show characteristic signs of group cohesiveness. You see very strong esprit de corps, strong feelings of solidarity, sense of we feeling that pervades the group. And it has a very profound effect on their morale and on their readiness to carry out the tasks of the group, and above all, to live up to the norms of the group. One of the consequences of high cohesiveness is a tendency for the members of the group to try to strive toward agreement. And this is a concurrence-seeking tendency that is at the core of groupthink.
Which is what happened in the Byrotonin decision.
Sure, the group was striving to agree, and that got in the way of their critical thinking. They failed to explore any number of indications that there could be problems associated with the use of that drug. They didn't follow up on those. They didn't consider the possibility that they might be letting themselves in for some real trouble, as has happened in a number of instances in which drugs were marketed before they were adequately tested and led to very serious consequences. So this is an example of how the failure to engage in critical thinking as a result of this striving for concurrence can lead to potential trouble. It doesn't always occur, but that potentiality is certainly there.
In your book, you list 8 major symptoms of groupthink. Perhaps we could begin by describing how these apply to the Byrotonin decision and then substantiate them with some examples that you use in your book.
Well, in the Byrotonin decision, you see examples of the illusion of invulnerability, which is one of the outstanding symptoms of groupthink.
We don't have anything to worry about.
I think we've got the most effective product in Byrotonin.
The illusion of invulnerability runs through the whole discussion of the group and underlies their willingness to take excessive risks. Now, that's a symptom that I encountered time and again in the case studies of historic fiascos. For example, in the case of the group that made the decision about the protection of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel and his group of high naval advisors also showed the same characteristic symptom of an illusion of invulnerability. The complacency of that group led to their being totally unprepared for the attack that the Japanese launched on December 7th, 1941. They ignored all of the various warning signals, assuming that the decision that they had made would give emphasis to training and supply rather than worrying about the defense of Pearl Harbor was the correct one. And, of course, that led to the total destruction of the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor and the loss of large numbers of lives.
They assumed then that the harbor was essentially impregnable. No one could attack it.
That's right, and that's the sort of thing that the illusion of invulnerability does. It allows people to feel very complacent, very secure, and go ahead and take whatever action the group feels is the one they want to take.
Now I'd like to try to relate some aspects of the groupthink hypothesis to related work in the area of group dynamics. Specifically, how a cohesive group tends to view an adversary group. We know from research in group dynamics that the we feeling, characteristic of a cohesive group, is often accompanied by a they feeling toward an opposing group. How does this tendency manifest itself in groupthink situations?
Well, I think we do see essentially the same kind of phenomena in groupthink situations as occur in various experiments like the Sharif's Robbers Cave experiment. Whenever a group is facing an important decision, a certain amount of stress is generated, and that's when you begin to see an increase in we feeling, an increase in group solidarity. Now, right along with that goes this tendency toward looking at outgroups as enemies and as evil. And that's where this very important additional symptom of groupthink comes into play, shared stereotypes toward the enemy.
Those FDA guys love to be troublemakers.
Some of those doctors could be quacks or professional cranks.
There are some impressive similarities between the barotonin group and some of the groups that I've studied in my research on historical fiascos. For example, the decision made by the group that surrounded Harry Truman in the fall of 1950, the decision to cross the 38th parallel and escalate the war with North Korea. Now, that was a decision that was made in the face of repeated warnings from the Red Chinese government, warnings that said that if you cross the 38th parallel, we will enter the war. We're not going to permit this. Those warnings were completely disregarded on the basis of shared stereotypes of the Red Chinese enemy. The stereotypes took the form of saying, well, this is a very weak country. They're completely dominated by Russia. Russia doesn't want war now, therefore we're perfectly safe in disregarding these warnings. So there you have an example where shared stereotypes toward the enemy led to a very risky decision that very soon led to defeat. In fact, it's been described as one of the worst defeats ever suffered by American armed forces.
You list rationalization as one of the major symptoms of groupthink. How dominant a role would you say rationalization played in the deliberations of the barotonin group?
Well, it was manifested a number of times.
It's a strict prescription-only product. Any doctor who doesn't feel sure about it doesn't have to prescribe it.
Well, they sound like the kind of symptoms that could be brought on by anything.
Now, of course, rationalization is a very human kind of response. Everybody engages in it from time to time. It's necessary for all of us to feel that what we're doing is wise and that we are respectful and respectable, upright people, and so on. What happens in a group is that when the group is converging on a given course of action, they begin to pool their resources and collectively begin to evolve certain rationalizations that they all share. And that helps all of them to maintain their self-esteem and their self-respect.
Much of the rationalization in the barotonin group seemed to have a moral tone to it.
Yes, and in this way, rationalization contributes to yet another symptom of groupthink, the group's belief in the inherent morality of the group. This enables them to avoid getting into discussions of moral and ethical implications of their decision.
We have built one of the finest reputations in the field by dealing squarely with the public.
This illusion of morality enables them to maintain their self-esteem.
Irv, there's something about your examples that you've been citing that seems very interesting to me. In your book, Victims of Groupthink, you make it abundantly clear that the individuals are not conforming out of a fear of recrimination, right? It's a highly cohesive group, and there's an atmosphere of acceptance and security. All right, well, in this cohesive group, then, why is it that no one feels free enough to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, we're kidding ourselves. We're about to make a terrible mistake?
Well, you point up a basic irony in group psychology. The freer the climate of the group, the greater the tendency there is towards self-censorship. We see this in the case of the participant who started to speak up in favor of the lawyer and was sort of interrupted.
You know, Harriet's got a good point. My God, if lawyers had the whole drug industry, it'd still just be making aspirin.
The group atmosphere was such they never spoke up again. Another symptom closely related to self-censorship is the illusion of unanimity, which was manifested by the barotonin group toward the end of their session.
Anyone else?
Now, this is a symptom that actually fosters self-censorship, because everybody has the sense that the group is in basic agreement. No one really wants to break the unanimity, and so people keep silent about their doubts.
So you don't need any external pressure in order to keep the group in line. This pressure can be supplied in abundance by the internal dynamics of the group.
Yes, especially when the primary goal of the group is to maintain feelings of cohesiveness. Now, of course, from time to time, members of the group feel doubts about what's being discussed, but they fail to express those doubts. Take, for example, the decision made by President Kennedy and his advisors in April 1961, the decision that led to the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., who was present at those meetings, has described his own self-censorship, his own failure to express the doubts that he had, because he felt that it would affect the unity of the group. And that's exactly the problem that arises. The people who have spoken in favor of the proposition think that everybody's going right along with them, and they assume that silence gives consent. In fact, Schlesinger found out from talking to people privately that they did have some doubts, but were not coming out with them in the meetings.
What about some of those situations in which someone does speak out?
Well, as I've implied, this happens rarely in highly cohesive groups. But when it does happen, direct pressure is applied to the deviant. We saw this in the case of the lawyer who spoke her piece in expressing an opinion that went contrary to the group consensus. The president intervened, indicating that what she was saying was not quite acceptable from the standpoint of the consensus that the group was arriving at. And at the same time, he pointed out that the group norm was one of essential agreement.
Okay, all right, let's try to stay together on this. I'm sure Harriet wasn't trying to upset the apple cart.
Of course, in doing so, he managed to prevent the group from becoming ruffled by the bit of dissent to which they were exposed.
The one symptom we haven't discussed yet is mind guarding, an interesting term which you described as analogous to bodyguards.
Just as a bodyguard protects a leader from being physically damaged, a mind guard protects him from being exposed to disturbing ideas. The executive who kept the scientist out of the executive committee meeting that we saw was functioning as a mind guard. He kept the leader and the other members of the group from hearing opinions that would be probably quite divergent from those of the members who attended the meeting. Later on, he presented the scientists in a stereotyped way that enabled the group to dismiss those ideas.
His sentiments, as always, are basically conservative. It's the usual stuff about wanting to test more and so on.
From research on group dynamics, we know that leadership plays a very important role in determining the climate of a group. What role does leadership play in preventing groupthink?
Well, since I've been talking about some of the historical instances of fiascos, let me answer that by talking about an instance that was not a fiasco and that did not involve groupthink, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Now, that crisis occurred just about a year and a half after Kennedy and his group of advisors had blundered into the Bay of Pigs fiasco. But now, essentially, the same group, faced with this crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, worked out a very detailed, careful decision that avoided the pitfalls of groupthink. We can learn something about how that came about if we look into the leadership practices of Kennedy in handling that group. First of all, on the matter of insularity, of keeping the group excluded from outsiders, Kennedy deliberately took steps to bring in experts from the outside. For example, Adlai Stevenson and Dean Acheson, in order to get their reactions to the assumptions being made by the group. Another thing that he did was to assign the role of critical evaluator to every single member of the group. And above all, he avoided being a directive leader. In fact, he deliberately absented himself from some of the meetings in order to make sure that he would not exert undue influence on their decision. In addition, at the outset, he was very careful to indicate that he wanted them to explore all of the alternatives to removing the missiles from Cuba, and did not mention the particular option that he thought was the most likely one that would have to be resorted to. In so doing, he left the members free to explore all of the pros and cons of each of the alternatives, and in that way helped to prevent the group from falling into the groupthink pattern. Now, it seems to me that the kinds of procedures that were used in that particular decision have potentially very wide applicability to preventing groupthink in many other situations, in many other kinds of groups. Now, of course, the next stage in research is going to have to be to test out some of these ideas for preventing groupthink. And that's what I'm looking forward to as the next development in research on groupthink.
In the wider context of group dynamics, the insights offered by Dr. Janis are only part of an ever-increasing search to better understand the patterns of group behavior. And while this film has concentrated on high-level business and governmental decision-making, the basic tenets of groupthink apply to any group at any level in which the tendency to agree interferes with critical thinking.
It was a good meeting, wasn't it? Yeah, it sure was.